Welcome to our first panel. My name is Folsom. I'm professor of history at Hillsdale College, and our first panel is entitled Free Trade or Fair Trade. And most of the time when we're talking about trade, we're talking about interventions in trade that might be contrary to free trade, and that's usually a tariff, which is a tax on imports. And usually when we have a tax on imports, we have people arguing that some industry needs to be protected, perhaps, or that you need to redirect trade in some way. So you have a tariff or some kind of intervention. If we look at what our founders said on the issue, they dealt with tariffs, but they looked at a tariff on imports as being the major source of revenue, not to protect, but to gain revenue. In the Federalist paper, number 21, Alexander Hamilton, who was to become our first Secretary of Treasury, said, "One advantage of taxes on consumption is that they contain in their own nature a security against excess. If duties are too high, they lessen the consumption. The collection is eluded, and the product to the Treasury is not so great as when they are confined within proper and moderate bounds. This forms a complete barrier against a natural limitation of the power of imposing them." In other words, if you tax too much, the use is limited and the revenue to the government, therefore, is limited. You choose your own tax by choosing to buy imports. This is a very different system from, say, an income tax, where politicians in authority choose the tax that you pay. A revenue tariff, you choose your own tax by the imports that you choose to buy. Now, the first revenue tariff in the United States in 1790 was 5% tax on all imports. And this, of course, would be, the money raised from this would be to pay off the debt from the Revolutionary War. So we have that 5% tax. There were a few exceptions to the 5% rule there. For example, imported canes, walking canes, had a 7.5% tax. Imported shoe buckles had a 10% tax. And imported carriages had a 15% tax. So we had a small group of exceptions. The founders were not looking so much to tax the rich or make them pay their fair share. The argument here was it was a luxury tax, and the people who could afford these items, the canes or the shoe buckles or the carriages, were people best able to pay for them, and that was the argument the founders made. Well, if we shift from 1790 to more than 200 years later to today, we have a whole new set of issues regarding tariffs and arguments, and the panelists today are well qualified to comment on free trade or fair trade. Our first panelist is Al Eckes, and Al is professor emeritus in history at Ohio University. He received his BA from Washington and Lee and his PhD from the University of Texas. He served on the International Trade Commission during Ronald Reagan's administration. He is the author of 9 books on economics and international trade. The most recent is entitled The Contemporary Global Economy. From 2004 to 2016, Dr. Eckes served as Executive Vice President of the International Trade and Finance Association, and he edited its journal, the Global Economy Journal. Al also served as president during one term of this association. His paper today is entitled, A Modern History of Trade in America. Won't you welcome Al Eckes?
Thank you very much, Bert. It's a great pleasure to be with you. I've learned a lot about Hillsdale College from a neighbor of mine in Florida. He tells me that he was the first student back in the late 1960s to lead a cow to the belfry of Central Hall. Since there could be outstanding warrants still, I won't tell you any more about him or his identity, but he certainly has given me a very favorable impression of Hillsdale. Let's talk about the trade mess this morning. I'm going to offer both a historical and a policy perspective. You know, based on the primaries, it's plain that many voters think the sinners in our society are political leaders who've betrayed American interests by negotiating flawed trade deals. The resulting job losses have led to wage stagnation for American workers, especially those without college diplomas. And so in election year 2016, we have populist politicians pounding the anti-free trade message. And the establishment is running scared, particularly as it pertains to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or the TPP. Today, I think you'll hear a variety of perspectives from those on this panel. Some of my colleagues may think that the voters and politicians need a basic course in economics. Others may believe that elite economists and Washington bureaucrats should spend more time traveling the byways of America to view the consequences of their actions. Let me say that in the past, I've supported free trade agreements among high-income countries, such as with the U.S. and Canada and Israel. But 20 years ago, I wrote a book, Opening America's Market, and at that time expressed concern that free trade among nations at vastly different income levels would exacerbate internal economic and political tensions. So I am not surprised that trade policy has become a toxic issue this year. And I am not surprised that presidential candidates on all sides are proposing to renegotiate past agreements and block new ones. As background for today's discussion, it may be helpful to review very briefly certain data about U.S. trade patterns. First, the U.S. continues to buy more merchandise from the rest of the world than we sell, and we've done this for some 40 years. The overall U.S. deficit in goods, there we are, rose from $111 billion in 1990 to $763 billion in 2015. You'll notice that the lines at the top, the yellow, the red, and gray ones, indicate that with China, beg your pardon, we've got the wrong one there. That's the one I wanted to show. On the left, you have the U.S. deficit from 1990 up to 2015, then the rising deficit with China, with Japan, and with Mexico. Now we'll move to a better discussion of it, the so-called current account deficit, which takes into account not simply trade in goods and trade in services, but also takes into account earnings, portfolio dividends, etc. You'll notice here that for the 35th successive year, our current account deficit is a deficit. It reached $463 billion in 2015 and should be about the same in 2016. Meanwhile, several of our leading trading partners, China, Germany, and Japan, have persistent and large current account surpluses. So how did the persistent asymmetric current account deficits emerge? Obviously, a number of factors have some impact. They include the strong dollar. They include interest rate and currency manipulations by central banks, globalization and labor cost arbitrage, investment and savings rates, differing rates of growth, the mercantilist strategies of emerging competitors, and flawed trade agreements. I want to focus on the last factor because I think many pundits overlook its long-term significance. In my view, our agreements are flawed not because our negotiators are stupid or second-rate hacks. They're flawed because they're driven by foreign policy. One of the first to observe this trend was Senator Russell Long of Louisiana, who chaired the Senate Finance Committee when I was confirmed in the early 80s. He impressed upon me at that time that U.S. trade policy has been the orphan of U.S. foreign policy. Little has changed. In today's world, trade policy remains largely foreign policy, and we have as a witness for that Alan Krueger, the Princeton economist, who's former chief economist, Council of Economic Advisors. Let me offer some historical examples to make the point. Let's begin during the Eisenhower administration. As the Eisenhower administration sought to integrate Japan into the world trading system and let it pay its way to recovery, the one-sided agreement given Japan in 1955 allowed Japan full access to U.S. and European markets at the lowest tariff levels, but it left the Japanese home market and agriculture totally protected from U.S. and European competition. The Japanese insisted in Friedrich List style on protecting their infant industries, auto, electronics, steel, and others against foreign competition. And we went along, largely, I think, for foreign policy reasons. By the 1970s and 1980s, these firms were national champions. They were successful competitors in the U.S. market, but the U.S. still could not access the Japanese market significantly. Let's jump forward now to the Bill Clinton administration, when the U.S. granted China permanent normal trade relations, that is to say, the lowest tariff rates, so that China could be integrated into the world trading system. Business loved it. It was the economic equivalent of tearing down the Berlin Wall, said one business advocate before Congress. But President Clinton allowed that the moral and national security arguments for providing China with this treatment were more important than the economic. As often happens, the gains that we were promised never realized. Instead, U.S. factory workers saw their jobs disappear to Asia. A flood of Chinese imports soon produced spiraling bilateral trade deficits. And one of the U.S. trade negotiators later admitted that the pact failed to deliver on expectations because of China's currency manipulation and subsidies. Congress established the U.S.-China Security Review Commission to monitor developments, and it continues to report substantial violations of China's commitment to the WTO, including export subsidies, failures to join the procurement code as they had promised, currency manipulation, and the like. Now, there can be no doubt that President Obama's administration also allows foreign policy to drive trade strategy, and we see this with reference to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. To achieve that goal, U.S. trade negotiators are proposing an ambitious agreement that would cover some 40% of the global economy. It would cover already free trade partners Australia, Canada, Chile, Mexico, and Singapore, but it would include Vietnam and Japan and several smaller markets. There would be a docking mechanism that would allow other countries, including China, to join. Former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton praised the TPP, quote, "It was the gold standard in trade agreements to open free, transparent, fair trade, the kind of environment that the rule of law and a level playing field." The TPP, like NAFTA and some other agreements negotiated in recent years, is far more than the conventional agreements that we're talking about when we talk about removing tariffs on goods. This is a comprehensive agreement that covers not only tariffs and non-tariff barriers, but it touches on services and investments. It includes regulatory provisions. It touches on intellectual property, government procurement, rules of origin, customs facilitation, sanitary and phytosanitary measures, technical barriers to trade, competition policy, labor and environmental standards, and heaven only knows what else. How will it impact the United States is the question that we ought to ask. Well, my former agency, the U.S. International Trade Commission, is charged with evaluating the impact of trade agreements. It threw up its hand and said, the impact of these provisions are difficult to quantify. It suggested the only minimal American gains from tariff reductions in the TPP. Now, the business community, the transnational community, loves it. The Chamber of Commerce says the benefits will be widely shared and quotes several studies that they may have subsidized. Organized labor, the Nader Group, oppose it. They're concerned about environmental encroachments, zoning, health, and public interest policies. But from my point of view, there is something that ought to concern all of us in this room, real issues of sovereignty. Because the TPP, like NAFTA and like some of the other trade negotiations, can be best described, in my opinion, as a lawyer's relief act. For it empowers lawyers and it allows corporations to bring quasi-judicial cases at will against member governments. I'm inclined to think the real victor from the TPP will be Vietnam. It will gain unobstructed access to the U.S. market for low-cost textiles and footwear. Some of these it may take from China. Strengthening Vietnam as a counterweight to China in Southeast Asia is President Obama's objective. During his May visit to Vietnam, he stated, "We're pursuing the Trans-Pacific Partnership not only to support trade, but to draw our nations closer together and reinforce regional cooperation." Now, since the economic argument for the TPP seems questionable at best, the foreign policy establishment is pressing the national security argument. Governor John Kasich of Ohio said yesterday in the Washington Post, and he's working with the Obama administration on this, expanding trade is about more than growing our economy. It's also about ensuring our national security and asserting the United States' willingness to stand tall against those who wish us ill. Well, Mitch McConnell, the Senate Republican Majority Leader, has said the Congress will not take up the TPP until the next administration, but watch him carefully. We will see what happens after the election. Let me make an additional comment about today's topic. Recently, I attended a conference in Washington, and I heard the U.S. trade representative make this claim, that we live in a free trade, fair trade world. His inside the Beltway interpretation rested on these premises. First, trade negotiators have largely succeeded in creating a free trade world free from significant tariffs and quotas. And second, they've created an extrajudicial system for addressing disputes and correcting unfair practices such as subsidies, dumping, and patent infringement. Well, if you look at data assembled by the World Bank and available on its website, you find that the average tariff for the advanced OECD countries is only 1.7%. The average duty on all U.S. imports is 1.5%, and on all dutiable imports, 4.9%. I would argue that a duty rate of less than 5% has much the same impact as a state sales tax. It has relatively little impact on international trade flows because currency fluctuations and transportation costs are likely far more important. Having achieved free trade, what are the elites working on? Well, they're hell-bent on rules and regulation for 21st century global business. The recent agreements thus have attempted to deal with regulatory problems that Adam Smith never contemplated in The Wealth of Nations. Many of these defy existing models. As a result, economists have a lot of difficulty evaluating trade and services, intellectual property, investments, competition, information, dispute resolution procedures. What is the impact on the United States of these provisions? Nobody really knows. Perhaps that's one reason that trade negotiations are no longer conducted by economists, for the most part. To ensure fairness in our contemporary free trade world, diplomats and lawyers monitor these agreements, and judges and dispute settlement panels resolve conflicts. Thus, it's at least arguable that we presently live in a world of free and relatively fair trade if fairness can be defined by the presence of rules and impartial dispute resolution panels. But if fairness means balanced outcomes, then obviously flaws in the agreement merit closer attention. There are no automatic checks against countries with perpetual surpluses or deficits. So how do we get out of the mess? Well, if Donald Trump is elected, the next administration will probably try to renegotiate some past agreements and use the leverage of access to the U.S. market to exact more favorable terms. Frankly, that's going to be extremely difficult because foreign policy and military and intelligence relationships also intrude on those arrangements. A Trump administration may push for sanctions against perpetual surplus countries. If Hillary Clinton is elected, Bernie Sanders supporters are likely to be stiff-armed, for the new administration most likely will make a few cosmetic changes to the TPP and push for congressional approval. This is precisely what Bill Clinton did to the NAFTA agreement negotiated by George W. Bush. I question whether any of these changes will satisfy those who are discontented and angry with current policies. I think that today's angry citizens are more concerned about personal stability than international stability and efficiency, but we shall see how events play out. A final comment. In light of the pervasive influence of lawyers, how can you economists influence trade policy? I recommend that you look closely at the example of Adam Smith and for once avoid his example. After writing The Wealth of Nations in 1776, what did Adam Smith do? For the last 12 years of his life, he served as a commissioner of customs for Scotland. During that period, the father of free trade, learned about practical problems of governance, and in effect became a tax collector for the mercantile state. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Yeah, thank you, Al. Our next speaker is Don Boudreaux. Don is co-director of a program on globalization at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Don has been chairman of the Department of Economics at George Mason from 2001 to 2009. Before that, he was president of the Foundation for Economic Education, and he's also taught at Clemson University. Don's PhD in economics is from Auburn University, and he also has a law degree from the University of Virginia. Don's written 2 books, one called Globalization. Another is a delightful book called Hypocrites and Half-Wits. This is my own copy that I bought 4 years ago when the book came out. I guess that's music to an author's ears to hear that someone bought his book.
Just one copy?
Only one copy. Don and I have been friends for 20 years. When you have a friend who writes a book called Hypocrites and Half-Wits, you open it up hoping not to be discovered within the pages. Once I saw that I was absent, I could sit down and enjoy the delightful book. It stems from letters to the editor that Don has written to the Wall Street Journal and various other publications over the years, where he talks about his ideas on free trade. His speech today is entitled, "The Elemental Case for Free Trade." Won't you welcome Don Boudreaux?
Thanks, Bert. I'm honored to be here. I should begin with a piece of advice that I read from the late Ben Rogie, who was an economics professor at Wabash College in Indiana, and it was in a talk that he gave at Hillsdale College in 1973. And Rogie said that it is impolite for a speaker to not be clear about his priors or biases. So I want to be clear about my priors or biases. I drive a foreign assembled automobile and in Virginia, and we get 7 characters in a space. And so I maximize my use of characters in space, and my license plate reads FRE space TRDE. So in 7 characters in a space, I convey a message. I figure that Twitter is far too voluminous for me. So I've distilled, I hope helpfully, the case for free trade into 10 simple points. And let me run through those for you. First, nothing about political borders justifies treating trades that cross those borders differently than trades that do not. Whatever benefits result from you trading with someone in Kentucky are no less available when you trade with someone in Korea. Whatever problems, real or imaginary, are caused by you trading with someone in Korea are no less likely when you trade with someone in Kentucky. Second, all economic activity is ultimately justified by how much it enables us to expand our consumption, not by how much it enables us to expand our production. Consumption is the end, production is the means. Of course, production is a very important means. We can't expand consumption without expanding production. But production is not the ultimate purpose for economic activity. If you disbelieve me, ask yourself how much you'd pay for a sawdust nail and cardboard pie that took its well-meaning baker all day to bake. If you answer nothing, then you get my point. Third, specialization expands output. And the greater the amount of specialization, the greater the expansion in output. A medical profession made up of only family physicians will save fewer lives and reduce less pain than a medical profession made up of specialists such as neurosurgeons, podiatrists, ophthalmologists, and my favorite, because one of these saved my young son's life many years ago, a pediatric gastroenterologist. Fourth, Specialization requires trade. A Manhattan-based pediatric gastroenterologist today enjoys a high standard of living only because many people willingly pay him to specialize in that highly specialized line of work and willingly accept his money in exchange for whatever it is they produce. This physician is rich only because he trades with others. If farmers, carpenters, tailors, airline pilots were unwilling to trade with this pediatric gastroenterologist, he'd have no time to practice his specialty. He'd instead have to grow his own food, build his own home, make his own clothing. He and the rest of us would be much poorer. Fifth, specialization increases with the size of the market. This is one of the great insights from Adam Smith. The greater the number of consumers and producers, the larger is the scope for each producer to focus on a narrow specialization. This fact is why large cities have niche restaurants such as Vegan Lebanese, which we have in Washington, D.C., and highly specialized physicians such as pediatric gastroenterologists who saved my son's life, while small towns don't have such highly specialized offerings. Points 4 and 5, working together, spark self-reinforcing improvements. More trade promotes more specialization, which in turn promotes more trade. Economies grow and standards of living improve. Sixth, expanding the area of trade, increasing the size of the market, results in what economists call increasing returns. Doubling the number of people who trade freely with Americans causes the GDP of this larger economy to more than double. Per capita GDP, per person GDP, rises for all of these people who trade freely with each other. Again, compare medical care with nothing but family physicians to medical care with many specialists. Seventh, there is no limit to the degree to which labor can specialize and to which, as a result, total output can expand and expand at an increasing rate. That is, expand in a way that captures increasing returns. Put differently, the degree to which labor can specialize and cause total output to expand is not limited to or defined by the size of any particular country, nor does the size of any particular country define a point beyond which the growth of specialization and output slows or becomes less reliable. That is, even in a country as geographically large and as heavily populated as the United States, nothing in economic theory or history suggests that expanding the boundaries of our trading patterns externally, that is, beyond our borders, results in less expansion of our consumption and production than when we expand the boundaries of our trading patterns internally. We in Georgia or Virginia stand to gain as much by expanding our trade with Mexicans as we stand to gain by expanding our trade with New Mexicans. There is no reason not to have a global economy without economic boundaries. Eighth, economic competition is good, and it works just as effectively across political boundaries as it does within political boundaries. Competition disciplines firms. It spurs entrepreneurial creativity, and it discovers and encourages, much like a process of natural selection, what works best economically, and it weeds out that which doesn't. Importantly, the competition that comes from trade, whether it be internally or externally, domestic trade or foreign trade, directs workers and other resources into those lines of productive activities at which each is most efficient. There is simply no reason to neuter with trade restrictions the competition that comes from abroad simply because it's not homegrown. Ninth, as the late, great Julian Simon taught, human beings in market economies are the ultimate resource. The ultimate resource is not land or petroleum or deposits of iron ore or of gold. It's not factories or software or tractors. It's not inventories of wheat. It's not inventories of rolled steel or inventories of any other product. It's human creativity and ingenuity. Indeed, it's only because human creativity made them so that petroleum and iron ore and wheat and you name it are resources to begin with. Without human creativity, these things would be mere raw material, mere stuff, mere physical things that are no more valuable to human beings than they are now to antelopes and to hamsters. And yet, human labor is one of the few resources that has consistently gotten more scarce over the course of the past 250 years. We know that human labor has gotten more scarce because its market price has risen enormously over the past few centuries in the market-oriented world. For example, the real hourly pay of the average American production worker is today about 60 times higher than it was in 1790, and that's a conservative estimate. This rise in the price of labor signals that it has become more scarce relative to the demand for human labor. In contrast, most other resources and productive inputs, including energy, metals, transportation services, chemicals, have become and are still becoming, by and large, less scarce. If we judge them as we should by the trends in their inflation-adjusted prices, they're becoming less scarce precisely because we have more creative human beings contributing to the market economy. Free trade maximizes the ability of people of a country both to contribute their own creativity and effort to the global economy and to tap into the creativity and effort of the billions of other ultimate resources, these human beings, that reside outside of our borders. We tap into that creativity directly when we offshore productive tasks to foreign workers. We tap into it indirectly when we buy goods produced by foreign workers and entrepreneurs. Why would we wish to artificially reduce our and our fellow citizens' access to supplies of the ultimate resource? 10th, restrictions on trade inevitably are driven by special interest group politics. Even if a sound theoretical case can be made for trade restrictions, it's simply unrealistic to expect the state to be guided by that case. Instead, the state will only use that case as a cover to create monopoly privileges for politically influential producer groups. I'm going to add an 11th here because just this morning I was having an email conversation with my great esteemed colleague, Walter Williams, whom some of you may know. Walter has spoken at Hillsdale many times, and Walter advised me to remind you that countries don't trade. China does not trade with America. America does not trade with China. People trade. When we say that America trades with China, what we mean is that flesh and blood people in the country of the United States are trading with other flesh and blood people in China. That's an important insight if you keep it in mind. Anyway, that's it. That's the fundamental or elemental case for free trade. But there's a second part to the case for free trade. It's the part that's been constructed in response to the multitude of misunderstandings that have arisen over the centuries with regard to international trade. The second part of the case for free trade is the longer part. The reason is that the capacity for misunderstanding and mischaracterizing trade is enormous. Many falsehoods require many corrections. Here I have time only to mention a few pieces of the second part of the case for free trade, this part that corrects the multitude of misunderstandings. By the way, nothing that I say here in the first part of my talk or the second part is controversial among economists who study trade. That doesn't necessarily make it right, but the very fact that there's a consensus among most economists about these matters tells you something. These are people who study this for a living and professionally, as do I. So here's one of the first corrections. First, and you will find here great disagreement on this panel. Over the long run, trade causes no net loss of jobs. Put differently, and hearkening back to a point made above, any change in consumer spending causes some workers to lose jobs while creating jobs for other workers. International trade is not unique on this front. The jobs lost today to imports are replaced tomorrow by other jobs. And these other jobs are, overall, better than the lost jobs because they are the ones at which the workers in the country have a comparative advantage. The workers are more efficient. The jobs lost are ones at which the workers have a comparative disadvantage, at which workers were not producing as efficiently. If you worry, as you might and as it's understandable to do, that the loss of a particular job today or particular jobs today cannot be made up for by the creation of new jobs, consider this fact. In 1950, the U.S. workforce was about 60 million people. The number of jobs was between 58 and 59 million. Today, the size of the U.S. workforce is 160 million people, and there are today 152,000 jobs. In other words, both the size of the U.S. workforce and the size of the number of jobs has increased by just over 150% in the course of the past 66 years. And the rate of unemployment today is a not too shabby 5%. The number of jobs in an economy is determined not by the freedom to trade or by protectionism, but by the size of the labor force and by the flexibility of labor markets. What free trade does, again, is to replace bad jobs with good ones. Protectionism protects bad jobs by denying the creation of better ones. I remember a few years ago, you might remember this too, my 18-year-old students don't because they're 18, but most of you are not 18. Back in around the turn of the century, the most recent century, the Atkins diet swept the nation. It was a fad. Krispy Kreme donuts, they said they closed some shops. They blamed it on the Atkins diet. It had nothing to do with free trade. It had everything to do with the change in consumer tastes and preferences. And this only reinforces my point that any time consumers change the way they spend their money, whether they spend the money by buying a foreign good or whether they spend their money, change the way they spend their money by buying new, different domestically made goods, some jobs will be lost, other jobs will be created in response to the change in consumer spending patterns. Another objection to free trade is that it is undesirable if it creates trade deficits. This is an egregious fallacy, because another name for trade deficits is capital surplus or capital account surplus. Every cent of a U.S. trade deficit is a cent invested by foreigners in America or in dollar-denominated assets. These investments not only return the dollars to the U.S., they also signal that the U.S. is a relatively attractive place to invest, and these investments enlarge our capital stock, which makes us richer and creates jobs, by the way. If commenters started referring to our trade deficit, if they stopped referring to our trade deficit and started referring instead to our capital surplus, which is an exactly equivalent term, there'd be a lot less misunderstanding and mischief. Trade deficit sounds bad, but there is in fact nothing about a trade deficit that is a deficit. It's exactly balanced by capital inflows. Unless you think it's bad for people to save and invest in America, then you should applaud rather than bemoan trade deficits. Finally, and let me say a word before I go on, also about bilateral trade deficits. This is an even more egregious understanding. It makes absolutely no difference whether we buy more from the Chinese than we sell to the Chinese. It's an old chestnut among economists, but it makes an important point. Each of you, unless you work at a supermarket, has a trade deficit with your supermarket. You buy a lot more from it than it buys from you, and yet you're enriched and it is enriched. The very fact that the United States, Americans, buy more from the Chinese is utterly economically irrelevant. It does not signal that anything is going wrong. There is no reason in economic theory or in common sense, by the way, to expect that in a world of nearly 200 countries, that trade between any two of them will be balanced in the sense of the imports equaling in value exports. There's simply no reason to believe that any more than there's reason to believe that you individually will have balanced trade with each of your trading partners. And yet the confusion that is spawned by discussions of trade deficits is never ending. It's dangerous and it's wrong to conclude that trade deficits are somehow bad for the United States. They're not. I applaud them. I don't bemoan them. Finally, it's a myth that high-wage Americans can't compete against low-wage foreigners. Specialization arises according to comparative advantage, which does not stop operating as the wages of workers in a nation rise relative to wages elsewhere. But this point is fairly esoteric. You have to read David Ricardo's Chapter 7 to fully understand it. Another point is that low wages reflect low productivity. The reason Americans' wages are higher than the wages paid to workers on average in Mexico, wages on average in China, is that Americans produce more per hour than do workers in those countries. So next time someone says, we can't compete, we high-wage Americans can't compete against low-wage foreigners, you should translate that in your mind to the equivalent, the exact equivalent. We can't compete against low-productivity foreigners. The latter sounds as silly as it really is, and yet saying we can't compete against low-wage foreigners somehow sends us into paroxysms of concern. But again, the only reason that wages are lower abroad in general is because Americans are so highly productive. I ask my students, when I make this point to them, I ask them how many of them would like but have not yet had LASIK surgery. Many of them. In fact, let me ask you, how many of you would like but have not had LASIK surgery? Raise your hand. Right. And give me one reason why not. Too expensive. I'm here to help you. All right? And I'm a doctor. All right? I'll perform LASIK surgery on your eyes for $2.99 a piece. $2.99 a piece. We got a deal? You do? Well, there's two things wrong with that. You'll be blind, and I'll be sued for fraud. Of course, you don't really accept. You would not let me, quite rightly, operate on your eyes, no matter how low the price, because I am not a very productive LASIK surgeon. I'm a terrible LASIK surgeon, so you don't pay me very much. The reason my wage as a LASIK surgeon is so low, and it's zero, is because I have no productivity on that front. I would also, by the way, I'd love to play quarterback for the New Orleans Saints. I'm from New Orleans. I would love to be in that arena. I once sent a letter to Tom Benson, the owner of the Saints, offering to play quarterback for a full season for the New Orleans Saints for a mere $50,000, less than I get paid now, and much less than Drew Brees, the current highly paid quarterback, gets paid. He did not respond. He did not take me up on my offer, despite the attractiveness of my low wage. The reason, to get back to a serious point, the reason our wages are high is because we're generally productive. That's why wages are high. Wages in America are not high by accident. They're not high randomly. Wages in China are not low by accident or low randomly. They're low in China because the Chinese are not very productive compared to how highly productive Americans are. Finally, let me just end with an ethical point. I know that the economic case for free trade is strong and unassailable. The evidence and the arguments are all on the side of free trade. But at the end of the day, I support free trade for an ethical reason. When you work and you earn money, it's your money. It does not belong to the state. It does not belong to your neighbor. It does not belong to the company down the block. Protectionism is the argument that the company down the block has a claim on your income. That if you choose to spend that income buying a car made in Japan rather than a car made in Dearborn, Michigan, if you choose to spend that income buying sugar made abroad rather than sugar made in South Louisiana or in Hawaii, that you should be penalized. And that's what protectionism does. It penalizes you from spending your money as you choose. I believe that's unethical. The state has no right to do that, and there's no economic gain from doing so. Thanks very much.
Good. Thank you, Don. Our last speaker is Ian Fletcher. Ian is an economist and author of the book, Free Trade Doesn't Work. From 2010, we'll have a good discussion. From 2010 to 2012, Ian was senior economist of the Coalition for a Prosperous America. Before that, he was research fellow at the U.S. Business and Industry Council. Ian has also worked as an economist in the private practice, serving mainly hedge funds and private equity firms. Educated at Columbia University and the University of Chicago, Ian lives in San Francisco. Ian's topic today is called Fair Trade. Won't you welcome Ian Fletcher?
Good morning. Now, we're not here to debate trade, surprisingly enough. We're here to debate free trade, and they're not the same thing. Trade and free trade are kind of like love and free love. The one is often used as an excuse for the other. They're not the same thing. I'm sure my opponents here, whose books I've read many times, can give you a long, long list of all the wonderful things about trade. And I would congratulate Professor Boudreaux on this beautiful list. But it's not trade we're debating. I agree with him about how wonderful trade is. It's free trade. That is trade without regulation. Now, some economists, by their own admission, simply don't care about the economic interests of Americans because they believe in an ideology that says it's unethical to do so. I'm talking about libertarians and globalists, not quite the same thing here. So they are, by their own admission, pursuing a different objective. And it's not especially rational for Americans to take their advice. If they want to offer policies about what's good for the whole world at the expense of the U.S., that's fine, but they're answering a different question. Now, libertarians have a related factual premise, which is mistaken, namely that there's no difference between what's good for foreigners and what's good for Americans, because there's no such thing as economic rivalry. Now, the fact is that international economic rivalry is something you can see every day. It's not some giant illusion that people hallucinate and have hallucinated in dozens of countries for hundreds of years, and that we somehow need to be psychologically disabused of. We don't live in a zero-sum world in which our gain is necessarily someone else's loss and vice versa, but we do live in a world where there's rivalry over income and wealth that either we get or they get. This is true in your personal life, in your career, and it's also true in economics for ultimately similar reasons. I would also like to point out that repudiating the right of the American people to pursue their own economic interests amounts ultimately to a repudiation of the legitimacy of American democracy and the legitimacy of our Constitution. Now, Professor Boudreaux just said political borders are economically meaningless. Now, the reality is that you and I live in America. So if you want to be indifferent to the economic success of the U.S., you can just take that nice job in Singapore the next time you're unemployed. I'm sorry, but it does make a difference where you live. Nations haven't become economically irrelevant, and they won't become irrelevant as long as they're relevant to the economic fates of the people who live in them. America's trade deficit, the difference between our exports and our imports, is around $500 billion a year. Because the deficit is the single best measure of our trade problems, this means that free trade is a big problem. It's a number comparable to federal budget deficits. So sometimes the aspects of this problem sound technical. So it's tempting to let your eyes glaze over. But it underlies a lot of more visible problems. When you look at poverty, for example, and drive through run-down cities and towns, free trade is a part of that. Not the whole thing, but it's a part of it. When you look at family breakdown because of poverty, free trade is ultimately a part of that too. The first thing free trade is doing to America right now is destroy jobs. When goods are produced abroad and imported rather than here, the jobs are abroad. Now, obviously, this would be okay if America were gaining other jobs due to our exports. But we're not, because we're running a huge deficit. So we have a net loss of jobs. I know the professor attempted to explain why this is impossible, but I'll pick apart his logic in a minute. Free traders will tell you this is okay because the unemployed will eventually go work someplace else. This is true, but it does mean people losing $28 an hour jobs producing cars and taking $8 an hour jobs flipping hamburgers. So it's a decline in the quality, not just the quantity of jobs. The second thing free trade is doing to America right now is deindustrialization. This means not only job loss, but the loss of entire plants and then entire industries. There's a myth being promoted that we're only losing quote-unquote primitive industries like basic steel manufacturing, but that's just not true. Boeing is losing the manufacture of aircraft wings to Mitsubishi of Japan. Does that sound primitive to you? Second slide, please. Thank you. This is a big national security problem. Free trade means we have no defense against militarily important industries being stripped away from us. There is not a single plane in the U.S. Air Force today that isn't dependent upon components manufactured by potentially hostile nations. And the military and civil industrial bases are related, so if you weaken one, you weaken the other. China knows this perfectly well. They have a strategy documented in considerable detail to use trade as a weapon of long-term military advantage against the U.S. Now, remember that when we say free trade, we really mean quote-unquote free trade, because trade isn't really free. It's basically free on America's side because we have very few barriers to imports anymore, but it's not free in the other direction because foreign nations manipulate their trade in a million ways. America's tariffs are well under 1%, by my calculation, of the volume of our trade, so we're basically free traders. But many foreign nations practice something called mercantilism, which is an economic strategy going back hundreds of years of gaming the system in international trade. This gets done in blatant and cynical ways by nasty, hard-edged governments like China, and it gets done in a polite, disingenuous way by politically correct governments like Germany. But it certainly gets done. They even admit it when they're talking to their own people and don't think foreigners are listening. So, how is trade manipulated? Well, for a start, governments engage in currency manipulation to control the price of their currencies. If you make a nation's currency artificially cheap, you'll increase that nation's exports and reduce its imports. China did this for years. Japan is still doing it. The entire euro currency is, to some extent, a giant currency manipulation scheme for Germany because it blends Germany's natural currency, the Deutschmark, with the currencies of a lot of nations like Italy and France that don't have Germany's strong export performance and thus have naturally cheaper currencies. Trade gets manipulated inside the economies of foreign nations too. For example, in Korea, if you buy a foreign car, it's well known this tends to trigger a tax audit by the Korean equivalent of the IRS. So people get the message, and they don't buy foreign cars. In Germany, the major banks tend to hold the shares of both companies and their suppliers. So if, for example, BMW tried to buy tires from an American firm rather than a German one, their bank would say, "You idiot, this company we own part of will go bankrupt, so knock it off." So people get the message. There are a lot of understandings, gentlemen's agreements. There's cronyism, and national governments are all for it. It's part of how the system works there. And given that they're doing well in trade while we're in a state of crisis, why should they give it up? The reality is that the U.S. right now is being forced to compete with foreign state capitalism. Now, I know some people will tell you that state capitalism can't possibly work, but I'm sorry, that's just empirically false. State capitalist countries are getting very rich, and they're kicking our butts in trade. Next slide, please. Thank you. So, why doesn't the U.S. do anything about its trade problems? In large part, this is because, quote, American multinational corporations simply aren't American companies anymore. They're given this pass because they may be headquartered here and are allowed to roam the halls of Congress as if they were Americans. But frankly, that's just the location of the CEO's office. And they like this situation just fine. As I mentioned before, you really do have to ask whether the person you're dealing with even cares about America's economy. Here's a part you've been waiting for. Free traders will often tell you that the trade deficit doesn't matter. It's just a psychological illusion and a mistake that we even care about it. Unfortunately, while this is a tempting story to believe because everybody likes a free lunch, ultimately, the idea that the trade deficit doesn't matter amounts to the idea that America can get a free lunch somehow by magic. So, it's important to think through the basic logic of trade just to understand once and for all how it really does work. So, the trade deficit basically means that we consume more than we produce, and we import goods to make up the difference. Now, when America imports goods from abroad, we have to pay for those goods in one of three ways. First, we can export goods, and that's what foreigners get in return. Second, we can transfer ownership of goods that we produced already, and that's when we give foreigners existing assets, like shares in Google or part of a shopping center in San Diego. Third, we can give foreigners goods we promised to produce later, and that's when we borrow money and go into debt to foreigners. So it's either goods we produce today, yesterday, or tomorrow, and that's it. One of these things must be happening, or else we must be trading with the North Pole, because Santa is the only person who gives away things for free. As a result, when America runs a trade deficit, it intrinsically makes us poorer over time simply because we owe more and we own less. Our net worth is lower. That is just accounting. Any contrary view is magical free lunch theory. So the trade deficit basically amounts to America living beyond its means. If it's a sustained thing, not just a fluctuation, it's a form of decadence. Another thing you need to watch out for when arguing about free trade is when people fake simplify the analysis. Professor Boudreaux, for example, just said that, quote, the economics of trade are straightforward. Now, I'm sorry, but managing my 401k isn't straightforward, so trillions of dollars, hundreds of countries, thousands of industries, and billions of people certainly aren't. Free traders oversimplify because they don't want you to hear what the details might tell you. His argument was basically any act of trade that is a voluntary exchange must have been good for both parties. Well, by that standard, it's good for a starving man to sell his shoes. Maybe in the moment, that's rational. But you're ignoring the question of how he got into the circumstances that forced him to sell his shoes in the first place. The policy question we face is not just whether to do any one particular trade, but what circumstances we want ourselves to be in when we do that trade, what bargaining position we want to have, because that will determine whether or not our trades are less advantageous than they could have been. And please remember, the issue here is not, do you buy the foreign good and have that nice Toyota or not? The issue is, would we be better off buying it from abroad or whether the equivalent had been made here? That's the correct baseline you want to set, right? That's the way you got to think about it. Now, the key economic theory here is David Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage, which goes back to the 19th century British economist. And I identified 8 hidden assumptions that it has. Free traders will try to intellectually intimidate you with economic arguments that sound too technical, but the key is it's usually not the argument itself that's the problem, it's usually the hidden assumptions behind it. The conclusions generally follow from their premises, but the premises are either wrong or at best questionable. What are these hidden assumptions? Things like assuming trade is broadly balanced over time, there's no trade deficit. Another assumption, capital isn't mobile between nations. It certainly is today, and Ricardo, the inventor of the theory, himself admitted that capital mobility would undo his argument. Another assumption is that capital and labor flow freely between industries in this country, so if trade kills off one industry, workers can just easily shift to another, and the unemployed auto workers of Michigan can go and build helicopters. Another assumption is that there are no so-called externalities, which means when the price of something doesn't accurately reflect its value. So, nobody's gaining a price advantage by ignoring environmental problems. No industries are special because they lead to the industries of the future, and if you lose them, you can't get that future. Another assumption is that free trade has no effect on income inequality, but it does. Yet another assumption is that free trade won't build up foreign competitors and make them more potent rivals, but it will. If you cease to grant all these dubious hidden assumptions, the math underlying free trade ceases to work. Always remember that when we talk about economics at the podium, we're not putting up equations, but this is all a surface covering up a big lot of mathematical structures. So when you look at the math, you can see mechanically, just with letters and symbols, that if you relax these assumptions, the case falls apart. So, you lose the purported proof that free trade is always best, and you arrive at the correct conclusion, which is that it's sometimes good for you, sometimes not. So a nation needs strategic, not unconditional integration into the world economy. It needs protectionism as part of its policy toolkit at least some of the time. Now, America used to understand this perfectly well. Free traders will often tell you that free trade is somehow the American way, sweet land of liberty, etc. So it comes as a shock to a lot of people to learn that, in fact, if you look at the real history, protectionism is actually the American way. All of the founding fathers were protectionists, and they said so. Every president on Mount Rushmore was a protectionist. Lincoln was a protectionist. Teddy Roosevelt. The U.S. had a tariff-protected economy from its founding until after World War II. During this time, we grew from being a third world backwater to being the greatest industrial economy the world had ever seen, which is kind of inexplicable if protectionism is this terrible policy that ruins economies. Next slide, please. The great protectionist among the founders was Alexander Hamilton, the guy on the $10 bill, the first Treasury Secretary, and the intellectual architect of American capitalism. So we have here some evidence from economic history that there might be something wrong with economic theory, not to mention libertarian ideology. Economic history has this amazing way of putting purely theoretical constructs to the test and telling you things people don't want you to know. Now, in fairness, there are economists and economic theories that have the right idea about this stuff. In fact, a lot of economists are considerably less stupid about these issues than the kind of economists who get on the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal. Plenty of economists know free trade has serious problems, but they tend to clam up about it in public because they're afraid the public will get the wrong idea and impose some stupid kind of protectionism. Now, the really interesting thing is there's nothing special or exotic about America's protectionist history. Every country in the world that has become a major economic power has done this, starting with England in the 17th century and continuing on to China and other countries today. There are variations between countries, of course, but it's a standard playbook. We used to understand it, and then we forgot. After World War II, we threw our markets open to the rest of the world for purely political reasons, to win the Cold War. We wanted to prop up foreign nations' economies and bind them to ourselves so they'd be dependent on us and not get too close to the Soviet Union. But there was never a point when economists figured out suddenly, hey, protectionism that we've had for 150 years is now wrong, and free trade is right. It was all politics, rationalized as economics after the fact. So the consensus in favor of free trade is really a political construct, which is exactly why it's crumbling under political pressure today. Last thing I want to say, since my time is up, is I'm the last guy on earth to be in favor of stupid forms of protectionism, which is why in my book I proposed a flat tariff that would be on the same on all goods, which would take political meddling out of the picture. Thank you very much.
Okay. Good. We have some time for questions from the audience, and we want to give our panelists a chance to respond and make additional comments. We emphasize at the Free Market Forum short questions as opposed to long statements. So we have our students here with microphones, and we're glad to take some questions. Mariana, go ahead.
Okay, I'll try to keep this short, but I'm Tyler Watts at East Texas Baptist University. In full disclosure, I'm a former student of both Professor Boudreaux and Professor Folsom. And I've just got to say, Donald Trump has been a real blessing to me as an economist this year. And let me explain, it's not because I agree with him. The apt description I've heard is a dumpster fire. but never before have we had a more relevant example of the anti-free trade mentality to play off of in the classroom. But anyway, I want to challenge the claim that Mr. Fletcher made that we have a net loss of jobs due to free trade. That is absolutely false. I actually looked at the numbers. They're easily available from Bureau of Labor Statistics. Manufacturing employment peaked in the United States in 1979, about 20 million jobs. And since then, we've lost 7 million manufacturing jobs, 37% decline. However, overall employment has grown 59%, and that's actually larger than adult population growth. So jobs growth has outpaced population growth since then. So if we lost manufacturing jobs but gained overall jobs, we had a net increase of 53 million jobs in other sectors, and 62% of those jobs pay higher average wage than the current manufacturing job. So we are indeed gaining jobs, and on average, we're gaining better jobs in terms of the average income. Yeah, there's more to say, but I'll wrap it up. The idea of deindustrialization is also, I think, specious. Factories have closed, yes, but the value of manufactured output has increased by over 100% if you look at the Industrial Production Index since 1979. So the idea of job loss is just nonsense if we look at the actual data put forth by the BLS.
Okay, thank you, Tyler. We'll hear responses from Ian Fletcher, and then Don and Al, if they'd like to respond, they can too. Go ahead.
First thing I'd like to point out is that what you just described is not a net gain of jobs due to free trade. It's a net loss of jobs due to free trade, and then a net gain of jobs in the economy overall, which of course has a lot of other factors impinging upon it. So we're talking about different things here. Second thing is, yes, when people lose their jobs due to trade, they will find something else. But as I said, that's people losing high-value jobs like $28 an hour jobs in automobile manufacturing and going to work at Blockbuster Video for $8 an hour. Hang on, Blockbuster Video closed. So, well, now you see the problem.
Where to begin? The argument that free trade does not result in a net loss of jobs is not an argument that the new jobs are created in export industries. It's an argument that the money that consumers save by buying less expensive and better foreign goods can be spent elsewhere. Those jobs, those expenditures can be in purely domestic industries that have nothing to do with exports. The number of jobs, as Tyler points out, has increased. Wage rates continue to rise, real wage rates, adjusted properly for inflation. I'll leave it at that because I know that other people want to ask questions.
Sure. Al, did you care to respond? Good. Let's have another question then. Who's next? Okay. Yes, back there. Go ahead.
Yes, I'm Dwight Lee, a longtime economic professor, and I'm beginning to have some concerns about free trade. For the simple reason, I just thought about this. I do shop at Walmart. And every time I shop at Walmart, I destroy somebody's job at Kmart. And I'm beginning to feel bad about that. And also, as Don Boudreaux points out, and this really burns me, when I shop at Walmart, I just increase my trade deficit immensely. They never buy anything from me. I've offered to give an econ lecture for a discount at the checkout counter. The friendly greeter throws me out. But thank goodness for economic history. This gives me hope, because I know from economic history that if my income dropped by 50%, my trade deficit with Walmart would decrease. In fact, during all of the 30s, during the Great Depression, the United States ran a surplus in their current account. So there is hope for me.
Any comments?
Can you put up, can you have the guy put up the slide from the, can you put up the slide, show the slide? So here's some economic history. There have been many studies done on the relationship between free trade and prosperity, measured in terms of changes in economic growth, increases in economic growth, per capita income, median median income in a country. Here are just a few slides. This one shows the relationship between freedom to trade and prosperity. The largest income gains, the highest amount of that large dark blue bar, those are countries that are freer. Oh, I went back. There we go. This is a measure of openness to trade. These data show that the more open countries are to trade, the greater the rates of economic growth in those countries. Here's another set of data that show the same. We could keep doing that all day long. The data are simply not on the side of those who assert that free trade reduces income growth, that free trade impoverishes a country. Britain adopted almost total free trade in 1846. It maintained that policy until World War I. The last half of the 19th century is widely and rightly regarded as the period of greatest income growth in Britain, and we have other examples similar to that in history.
I can respond to that very easily. I'm familiar with the figures you're showing us to talk about how wonderful free trade is. Those are figures that show how wonderful trade is. As I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, we're not here to debate trade, and I agree with most of my opponents about all the great things that trade does. Free trade is a very different thing. Most of the countries that go into those statistics talk about how great trade is. These are countries that the openness of their economy is measured by imports and exports. They have booming exports. They either have balanced trade or they have trade surpluses.
That's simply untrue. That's just not correct.
We can't argue the fine points of statistics in front of an audience because we don't have the resources.
It's not true that these countries all have balanced trade. It's just not the case.
Not every one of them, but I am familiar with the data set in question, and there are other data sets that ask the same question. They ask the crude correlation. If you have more trade as a country, are you more prosperous? The answer is yes, and I don't dispute that. But this is largely because these countries use trade as a tool. They're either aggressive mercantilists who run trade surpluses, or at least they keep their trade in balance. Very few of the countries that make up the successful economies that go into this data set and make it look good actually have a free trade policy like the United States. Always remember that.
Like Hong Kong?
Al, do you have any comments?
No, let's go on with the questions.
Go on to another question. Do you have another question? Over here?
Yes, Jeff Heyman from Cedarville University. I understand question is for Mr. Eckes, and if Mr. Fletcher wants to chime in, he can as well. You were going over the history of kind of a trade deficit for quite a number of years, and that included periods of time where we've generally thought that the economy was going fairly well, including the 80s and 90s. It strikes me that we're talking about the angst of free trade being a problem now, and we're in a time where we haven't had 3% economic growth for 10 years. We've got regulation climbing through the roof. How do you distinguish and put the blame on free trade versus other possible causal factors in the economy today?
Al, would you like to respond to that?
Well, I didn't think I placed the blame on free trade necessarily. I was just pointing out particularly the period 1990 up to 2015, we've run consistent deficits. Now we can debate the significance of the deficits, and it's obvious that we've done that. Perhaps Ian would like to address it.
If you're asking me to identify what percentage of our economic problems are due to free trade as opposed to other causes, that is, of course, a very difficult question, largely outside my own specialty because, for example, I'm not a specialist in the economics of overregulation. So you want to know what percentage of our problems are caused by overregulation or what percentage are caused by the misfire in our financial system and then whose fault was that, et cetera. You're asking me to talk about slices of the pie that I'm really not expert in. I can tell you that when you have a trade deficit of $500 billion a year, that's not chump change. So free trade is a significant and meaningful part of our problems, to be sure.
Don?
Can we put the graph up that's currently on the... This is a graph that shows the relationship between real GDP growth in the United States and the real trade deficit of the United States. The bars of the trade deficit. The line is, the blue line, the top blue line is GDP growth from 1969 through 2012. I challenge you to look at that graph and say that the trade deficit has had a negative impact on real GDP growth. Remember, the trade deficit is offset by capital inflows. And by the way, it's not the case that the amount of capital in the world is fixed. When foreigners invest in America, oftentimes, not always, oftentimes capital is created. When Mr. IKEA sells furniture to Americans and then builds a store in Newark, New Jersey or Dale City, Virginia, that's creating more capital. More opportunities created, more consumer output is created, the capital stock grows. It is not the case that Americans grow poorer. When we celebrate it, when our neighbors save, and our next door neighbors save and invest, because we understand that that increases the productivity of our economy. There is no reason why we should not celebrate in the very same way when someone from China or Mexico or Uruguay or Russia, well, maybe not Russia, or Canada invests in the United States. It has exactly the same impact, no greater or less than it does when our next door neighbors save and invest in the U.S. And that's all the capital surplus, as I prefer to call it, is.
Okay, the problem here is a problem of baselines for both the things that Professor Boudreaux said. The first thing is, if you look at the graph of real GDP and trade deficit, it is indeed true that our economy has continued to grow despite the fact of having a trade deficit. That's not the question. I never said otherwise. The issue is not, are we doing reasonably well despite this problem? The question is, would we be doing even better if we had had balanced trade during this period than if we'd had what we actually had, which was a massive trade deficit? So that's part one. It's the wrong baseline. It's not a question of are we doing well. The question is, are we doing better than we would have been if we didn't have this problem? Now, for part two, the trade deficit, the so-called capital inflow. It's absolutely true that when America runs a trade deficit, the money has to come back here somehow. So yes, we have a capital inflow, but take a look for a second at what that means. When foreigners move capital into the United States, it means they now own something in the United States. It belongs to them. Now, the question is, what would have happened if we hadn't had this deficit? Well, they wouldn't be owning it. We would. So again, it's a baseline question. It's not, can we do well running this trade deficit, gradually selling off our assets to people in foreign nations? The question is, would we be better off if we hadn't had to run this trade deficit and hadn't had to sell off our assets?
Do we have another question? There?
Mr. Fletcher showed a slide with a list of products that have been lost to production in the United States. And as I looked at that list, I believe that every single one of those products is available in greater quantities and at lower prices to the advantage of American consumers. Mr. Fletcher, is there any instance on that list where that is not the case? Because I could be wrong.
As I said before, the question is not, can we do well, that is, in this case, enjoy a low-cost, high-quality consumer economy with the problems that free trade gives us. The question is, would we do better if we didn't have this problem?
Don, did you have anything?
No, I think that baselines are, of course, important, but let's go on to other questions.
Yeah. I think we have time for one more. We have about 5 minutes left. I think the mic is over there. Yeah.
On behalf of Milton Friedman, I have one short question. Let's assume we follow a policy of free trade and everybody else protectionist. Why should we, the American consumers, complain if foreign governments force their taxpayers to subsidize the goods that we get?
I completely agree. If people would like to, foreigners would like to give us things for free, I am more than happy to take it. As Bastiat said, the sun gives us very valuable heat and light for free every day. We don't complain. We don't erect tariffs against the sun. And so if foreigners want to ship to us low-cost goods, let's have them. We will become wealthier. They will become poorer.
As I said before, there is, quoting Milton Friedman, there ain't no such thing as a free lunch. When we run a trade deficit, we have to pay for these goods either by selling off existing assets or by going into debt. These foreigners who are, quote, stupidly subsidizing their exports to give us free stuff are not stupid. They are countries that are growing 8 to 9% a year, like China. They are countries like Germany, which are lending us money and we're borrowing it. So they're the failed socialist hellhole that practices this stupid mercantilism, and we're the smart free markets. No, I don't think so. Foreigners do this because it's a strategy and because it works. There's no free lunch.
Do we have time for one more? By the way, we won't be able to get to everybody who asks questions. We welcome, if you have questions, to come on up after the session, which will end at 10:45, and ask the panelists. They'll be glad to talk with you. Do we have one more? Where's the mic? Okay, good.
I have a question about, what do you think about patents that are being made on things that aren't even exist yet?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear say that again.
What do you think about patents that are being made on things that do not exist yet? People holding patents on things that do not exist.
How can they do that?
The idea is
Don't
what
they
is
have to
being
file a
patented.
patent?
Is that going to help or hurt?
Okay.
And I have one other question. What do you think about giving internet control to foreign governments? Is there an
That's kind
economic-
of off the subject of the panel, the internet control. We're concerned with trade in this discussion.
Is that going to,
in this
but
panel.
is it going to affect
Yeah.
trade?
Do we have another question?
I'm Kwa from Sterling College. I think free trade or fair trade, we have to treat it as a national business. I think the policy has been framed by lawyers, bureaucracy, economists, academics, and we are getting nowhere. It should be framed more by business people. The problem that we have is, number one, very high tax rate. 40%, we are one of the highest in the world. Secondly, we are not framing the exchange rate to our advantage, and China is doing that to their advantage. Thirdly, we have too much laws, Sarbanes-Oxley and Frank Dodd. And as a result of that, we have $2 to $3 trillion of corporate profits being parked overseas. And also we have tremendously unfair trading. So how do we improve that?
Would any of the panelists care to comment?
Yes. If I'm not mistaken, the honorable gentleman is of East Asian origins, and I would like to compliment his countrymen on having mastered the economic wisdom which the United States used to understand for 150 years. The development of Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and now China has been based on pretty much the same playbook as the U.S. used to rise from being an agricultural backwater to an industrial superpower. So the basic answer is we need to get back to the old program.
By the way, I'm very pro-American.
I'm sure.
Stop. Al, that'll be the end of our session. Thank you for attending. Go ahead, Matt.